Scorsese had said to someone, "What's the best unfilmed crime novel?" And the guy had said The Grifters. Then I think this chap wrote a draft, which I never read.
It was brought to us. It was a book. There might have been a some sort of spec script, but I don't really remember. It was brought by two men who, one of them I think was an archivist, Robert Harris, and then James Painter, I think his name was. So the two of them, not really film producers necessarily, but fell in love with the book and brought it to Marty. And then we fell in love with it. Marty wasn't going to direct it. He was in the middle of, he had Goodfellas, he had Last Temptation, he had a lot of work on his plate. So we decided to find a director, and that's how we came across Stephen Frears.
One day, Martin Scorsese rang me, and I'd spent my life waiting for him to ring. Anyway, I got did I know this book, The Grifters? And in fact, I had a copy of it. I had a sort of omnibus edition of Jim Thompson, and it was in there. I hadn't actually read it, but I read it, and then I went to meet him in New York. Eventually, I realized that Scorsese, I realized that Scorsese had seen My Beautiful Laundrette and worked out that the man who made that had the qualities necessary to make The Grifters. And I always thought that was that was rather an extraordinary thing to do. I mean, he is a very, very clever man, and in his sort of priestly way, I suppose, wise. And he'd worked out that something that you might call antisocialness that was in My Beautiful Laundrette was what you needed for The Grifters. I mean, when I eventually worked that out, which took some time, I never actually asked him why he chose me to make The Grifters. But I thought, goodness, that was clever. What a lucky fellow I was.
Well, Stephen seemed like a really perfect fit. We had a development person, Ann Harrison, who actually proposed him, probably with some other directors. And he just seemed like such a perfect fit because his movies were usually about unusual people, or not necessarily the usual movie character, and certainly not usually the American movie character that we've come to know. So he just seemed as though he might understand these characters and have fun with them. I think what was so interesting about Stephen is he really seemed to have fun with it, and was kind of fearless about it, which I think is one of the reasons the movie worked so well.
In the early 1980s, there was a comedy group called the Comic Strip who were quite anarchic, alternative comedy. Dawn French, Jennifer Saunders, Rick Mayall and Peter Richardson who had put the group together, and they were on about their third or fourth film, that half-hour film that they were making. They plucked up the courage to ask the then already quite famous director Stephen Frears to come and shoot one of their half-hour shorts. And Stephen's reply was, "Okay, I'll come and direct you for one episode, but I'm not going to do any pre-production. I'm just going to turn up Monday morning and start shooting. So you organize it, you know what you're doing, you supply everybody, and I'll just arrive and direct." So that was the deal he made. And so they then came to me, because I'd already shot 2 or 3 of their films before, and said, "Well, would I like to shoot it, with Stephen directing?" Of course, I went, yeah, because he'd done The Hit, he'd done Bloody Kids, he'd done a lot of things I'd seen and really liked, mostly with Chris Menges at that time. So that's actually how we met. We met on, and then we did 2 or even 3 together of these short films. And I was making a transition from doing lots and lots of rock and roll videos into drama at that time, and so I kept suggesting really crazy angles and crazy lighting, and Stephen kept looking at me as though I was mad, and would often repeat the idea of, "Well, yes, but does that shot tell the story?" And I'd think, "Oh, yeah, maybe not. It's a great shot, but it's not telling the story." So I really. It was a big learning curve for me in the difference between making startling pictures and telling the story, and that was a great thing. And then a few years later, no, not a few years, maybe 1 year later, My Beautiful Laundrette came up, And I was sitting in somewhere in South America shooting a Rolling Stones kind of long form video. And my agent said to me, "Oh, Stephen's considering you for this film, My Beautiful Laundrette. Do you want to read it?" And I said, "Sure." So they sent it, and I thought, this is amazing. It's such a good script. But I assumed he'd asked Chris Menges to do it because he was his sort of regular guy for bigger films. Well, mind you, that was 16mm Channel 4, but I was pretty convinced Chris, who was way ahead of me in the kind of stakes, I thought he'd get the job, but fortunately he just won an Oscar for The Killing Fields, and Roland Joffe had just asked him to do the mission at that exact moment that Stephen wanted him for My Beautiful Laundrette. So luckily Chris turned it down, and then that meant it kind of fell to me. So basically that started the almost 15 years of working together. In about 1987, 88, The Grifters came up, and then Stephen asked me to shoot that, and so that's how I was involved with it, really. And it was kind of low budget, California, I think either non-union or, it was all a bit certainly wasn't a Hollywood movie, let's put it that way. It was a strictly independent movie with a lower budget. Peggy Reisky producing it, who was a fantastic producer, very smart.
Anyway, I read the script, got ready, went over to meet Stephen, and I thought I'd be asked all these questions about, what was it like working on this or that. And we actually just wound up talking about books mostly, culture, other people, and the dark side, And I remember starting to talk about, the aunt that flirts a little bit too much with my brother and things that start to feel like just the hint of incest. And we just had a wonderful conversation talking about this stuff. And, and I got the phone call that they wanted me to come to LA to produce the film for Marty and Barbara in their absence. And history was made.
Yeah, of course, I was sort of nervous because I was suddenly working with and for my heroes, which is a privilege in its own right. And over the years, you often work with people that you haven't got quite the degree of respect that perhaps the job requires. But in this case, I had such enormous respect for both of those giants of filmmaking that it was awe-inspiring. And Thelma Shoemaker as well. These were people that I looked up to, and indeed in the process sort of taught me a lot. I had a lot of contact with Elma during the writing of the score and recording and editing of the score. Marty and Thelma Shoemaker were supportive from the get-go, and I felt like I'd sort of joined a family and was being looked after. I never felt sort of threatened by them or intimidated by them. They just supported us and basically said, "We like what you're doing, carry on, go do what you want to do." And so that, with the security of being with Stephen, I felt I could play.
I mean, we were both really, for some reason, drawn to really dark stories. And it's interesting, not just this book, but a lot of his books. This book was really about if you look at it from the point of view of just a story, it's about a son whose mother comes back to reconnect and then doesn't get along with his girlfriend.
I love the book. I like film noir, and he is very, very good at it. But the script actually had a slightly different focus, and this was Stephen's take on it. He really felt it was Lily's story. And I think when most people read the book, they would think it's Roy's, but for him, it was about the women.
I remember a chap who ran a bookshop said, he writes under another name, the name Richard Stark. He wrote the novel on which Point Blank was based. So you think, that's pretty classy. So anyway, Donald was approached, and he said he wouldn't do it. And I said, "What do you mean he won't do it?" I'm sort of shocked by this. "Can I speak to him?" And I was in Paris. And I spoke to Donald, and he said, "No, I don't want to do it." And I said to him, "It's about the women." And he said, "Oh, well, in that case, I'll do it." So I've somehow said the right thing, and then he agreed to do it. Then he wrote a copy. He wrote a draft of it. And I said, no, I don't like this at all. And we were always very scrupulous about not reading this other fellow's draft because that way lies lawsuits, and you have to be seen not to have touched the parcel it's in. So I remember Donald. He said, right, sit down. Show me the bits of the book you like. So I went through. I said, oh, I like that bit. I like that bit. And then he said, I'll write you a script of the bits you like. I went through. I listed the bits I like, and he said, my God, you really do like B movies. I had enormous trouble getting a cast, not because people didn't want to do it, but I didn't understand the mechanics of Hollywood casting. I'd made Dangerous Liaisons, which had been a successful film, so I was clearly smiled upon by Hollywood. And then there was a long period when it was as though they were deciding who I could have. I remember thinking, in the end, I thought, this is really not my decision. They will tell me who I could have, and that's sort of the end of it. So originally I had a cast of Melanie Griffiths and Gina Davis. And Melanie was going to play the mother. And then she disappeared. I think her husband, who was the guy in Miami Vice, said, no, you can't do this. She disappeared. And then I don't know why Gina pulled out. But she did have the grace to say, I realized I made a mistake.
The actor that was attached to it at the point I became involved was actually Cusack. He was mad for the book and very much wanted to do the movie.
I do remember talking to his agent, I think. He was very young at the time. And I remember talking to her, we were just talking, not about money, but we were talking about his schedule, it was sort of hard to nail him down.
I remember I started casting in New York with Juliet Taylor. And I remember Juliet Taylor saying, the next chap who comes to the room is the one you want. And that was John.
Yeah, he was very interesting to light. I particularly loved the sequence when they're dining together, Annette and him, and she's talking about the good old days with the flashback and all that. And I thought John in that scene, there's something about the way he looked in that scene and the way it was a combination of, I decided to use some really kind of old-fashioned, almost Hollywood-style 30s type of lighting for that scene, with the shaded foreheads and the light in the eyes. So they had it was like a sort of Marlene Dietrich type lighting.
Sissy Spacek came in the room. Jim Thompson wrote a book about a mother who could be mistaken to be the sister of her child because she was very young. And I remember Sissy Spacek, and she was great. And I said, oh, you could make, she'd be very, very realistic and believable, and all of that you would emphasize. Then Sissy Spacek. Then there was a half hour before Anjelica was going to come, Anjelica Huston. And Scorsese suddenly said to me, I've never seen Anjelica Huston act. And I said, haven't you seen Prince's Honor, for which Anjelica had won an Oscar? He said, no, that was the Irish making fun of the Italians. I thought, I've come to a country of lunatics.
Anjelica was incredible, and she was great to work with. I mean, she was committed, and also there was a lot of stuff going on in her personal life at that point that I think making the movie was just a huge relief. But it was a demanding role, and she threw herself 110% into it. I mean, Anjelica's style of performing is a little like a thoroughbred. You're going to get a lot of different takes and a lot of different shadings. And that was the gift. Stephen knew how to harness all that and bring it into shape for a really powerful performance. And then Annette as the counterpoint. I mean, Annette was already starting to break because of Valmont.
She'd done Valmont, which, was obviously, because it's the same story as Dangerous Liaisons, was sort of part of my life in some way. Annette was like, she's just played Gloria Graham. Well, that was who she was like. She was always like Gloria Graham. She always had that rather sort of ditzy, blonde, dumb blonde. She was always wonderful. And she was a very, very good actress. She is a very, very good actress. Really extraordinary. And an extraordinary woman with a past that I never fully understood.
I don't remember having concern about violence against women because as I say, for me, it's a feminist film. Again, it's about women who ultimately aren't successful and who wind up being undermined and destroyed by their own dark impulses. And in another way, it's about women who have to grift in order to survive because, frankly, so much of the world and the culture is stacked against them.
J.T. Walsh, he was great. He died young. He died quite not many years later. He was terrific. Yeah.
Oh, JT, I worked with on another film as well. And that guy, he just makes it look so easy. And he so assumes the skin of these somewhat sleazy characters. But he was great. He had that twinkle in his eye. But at the same time, when he goes crazy, you feel like he's really gone off the deep end. And, he was wonderful to work with.
There's certainly 10 or 15 minutes of the film that we cut. A whole subsection involving Steve Buscemi.
Oh, God, I always felt bad. I knew Steve, and I kept saying, Stephen, will you just tell him he's not going to be in the movie? And it went on, and Steve and I have a mutual friend, and finally I got a hold of him and just said, look, I'm really sorry. Your scene it got cut. It hit the floor, but you're great, as we all know. And this was at a point when he wasn't still as prominent and well-known as he is now. But Steve was like, oh, okay, I get it.
So Elmer Bernstein came to see me at the Chateau, and he said, how did you get fanfare for the common man for My Beautiful Laundrette? And I said, well, we stole it. He said, well, it would have cost your budget to pay for it. Anyway, he came to see me, and he'd done the Frank Sinatra drugs film. I mean, he was a wonderful composer. He'd been a sort of prodigy in his time. He would tell me extraordinary stories. So we got Elmer to do the music, and Elmer came to London, and then we recorded it in Dublin. And the music was brilliant, but it was all somehow the wrong way round. And that was very confusing. And then after a time, we went back into the cutting room and we put the title music at the end, and we moved the music around. And I said to Elmer, you better look at, with the help of another composer. We moved it around, and I said to Elmer, you better come and look at this. And he looked at it, and he was quite a formidable man, Elmer.
Stephen felt that he liked the music, but he moved it around and cut it and changed it, but nothing was ever re-recorded as far as I remember. It was just that he moved things and sort of trimmed them and maybe put some score in a place where Elmer didn't necessarily intend it to be.
They brought the film to New York and we screened it there, and I remember that, the score was brilliant, but it did feel to me that something was throwing it off, that it wasn't completely working.
Elmer called me up very upset, very angry, but also hurt, I think. Elmer had a great career before and after, and was very unhappy that his score had been violated, I guess we can call it. Though when I look at it now, I don't think they really changed it. They just move things and cut things. And so, but he was so upset. He called me, I think he just wanted to vent. It wasn't personal. He didn't say anything, he didn't yell or anything. He was just really unhappy.
The script supervisor, who was wonderful, Mary, and a close friend of our lovely producer, Peggy Reisky, timed it out very, very carefully so that the timings all worked. Once you sunk them up at a certain point, they were all going to turn their heads at the right time, give or take a little bit of fudging. But in those days, the idea of making a split screen, which you would do in an instant on an Avid, because we were cutting film, I think I went to, in California, in Los Angeles, I went to a TV station offline in some way where I could overlap the images, because I couldn't do that with the actual print. And I timed it out in that way, and we got a rough of that TV version, if you like, and offline, and made that on film and made adjustments to the timing, micro adjustments, so that everything happened in the right time in the right place.
The scene where Roy gets killed, I mean, it still makes me uncomfortable just thinking about it. It was it was the most ambitious scene in a lot of ways that we were shooting. It was 3 cameras. You knew you were only going to get one shot at it. You had the rigs with the gag. We're a low-budget movie. You're not going to get a lot of times to do this again. And anyway, they walk in, they do the scene, and when she smashes that briefcase into his throat and the blood starts coming down and he slides down, she started convulsing in tears and keening over the body. This camera stopped and she just cannot stop sobbing. And Stephen comes over to me and goes, "Go take care of her, dear." And I'm like, okay. Anyway, I walked over to Anjelica. We walked in a separate room, a different part of the set, sat down on the bed, and she just kept going. I just kept thinking of my father, and she couldn't stop crying. He hadn't died that long before.
I think that exemplifies, I mean, it's a dialogue scene, but there's so much going on, and having to bring all the strands of their relationship together that allows you to bring together what is really the pinnacle of what is a Greek tragedy of the mother that, by default or design, murders her own son, then grieves over him, and then steals the money, and then goes to hell because she basically descends in the lift. I remember very well that the lift, or elevator as they say in America, the elevator, we shot it only I think on 1 floor, but when Stephen and I saw it, we said, well, let's make her go further and further down because she is going to hell now. So I joined up all the bits that I had to make it appear that she was going down more flights than we had shot, and then she just drives off into the night, and it's the most wonderful ending, tragic ending for the mother.
Harvey bought it, the wicked Harvey bought it. And I think he bought it unseen. I remember a screening in New York and he was found lurking in the projectionist, so we threw him out. Anyway, then he bought it.
This was when Miramax was Miramax and it wasn't part of Disney. But I remember Harvey calling me like twice a day because he wanted the movie so much and was really excited by it. And it was pretty early days, I think, at Miramax. So he really wanted. He kept calling me. So he called me twice in one day, and I kept thinking, he's negotiating against himself. There's like nobody else was calling. So he was really excited. I think they did a good job. I do remember there's some sort of screenings. I don't know if they're formal test screenings.
Listen, I was a complete newcomer. How can I wasn't in a position to say, oh, you should do this or you should do that. I knew nothing. And the idea that, there were good and bad way to release a film, I had no idea about that. I was protected by Scorsese.
I'm not against test screenings, but I think the way I use them, and in fact, the way I know a lot of other filmmakers use them, is not always in the, hey, let's read the cards. The truth is, when you get a bunch of strangers in a movie theater and you watch the movie with them, it's like scales fall from your eyes. Things just appear to you of like, oh, God, you're right, we don't need that. How about if we move this?
Which brought us to, I think, the voiceover at the beginning, because people were having trouble understanding what Lily did at the track.
There were discussions between us all about how we were never going to be able to really educate an audience into the mechanics of the horse, to the betting with the horses, and did we really care, of what was actually going on? It was more an impression of how the grift on the racecourse was going.
And then there's a shot of her going down in the lift. And of course, I knew the Maltese Falcon very well. And the Maltese Falcon ends with Mary Astor being taken down by the cops in a lift. So I thought, I like all of that. And indeed, Anjelica referred to it as a homage to her father. She used to say to me, oh, I wish you'd known my dad. And she would describe how her father would say, just do it, honey, when she was being difficult as a child. Just do it, honey. And it wasn't a huge success. It got these Oscar nominations. It got 4 nominations, which were wonderful. Maybe that was early Harvey. Maybe that was when he was learning how to do it. Listen, I have no complaints. It's not that you you know, I know the films of mine that people like and respond to. And people always talk to me about it.